We're gonna back it back. We're gonna back it back, Jack.
So as I've played some Haitian music for you, we shall kick off. So first off, Jerry, do you think you can perhaps introduce a bit your book to us, and what has inspired you to write it?
Well, the book's about Lucas, who is a young and very inexperienced journalist who gets sent to Haiti at a time when nothing much seems to be going on to research a documentary that they're planning in about a year's time. But when he arrives, street protests suddenly erupt and thousands of people come out on the street, and the army panics and closes the airport and introduces martial law. So Lucas can't leave, he's trapped there. And his news editor obviously wants him to go and report on street demonstrations, so off he goes. And he meets Marie, who's the daughter of a local Haitian journalist. She is 100% for the revolution. She's a real revolutionary. Lucas is obviously expected to remain somewhat detached from what's going on and report objectively. But he's out of his depth. He's surrounded by deceit and lies, not quite sure what's going on, and becomes very dependent on Marie to guide him through a culture that he doesn't understand. And it becomes fairly quickly apparent that possibly between the two of them, they might be able to topple a dictator. But in Haiti, then and now, life can be cruelly short. And I'll stop there, otherwise I'll give too much of the plot away.
Thank you for this brief introduction. You spoke about the idea of interculturality and how sometimes you might not necessarily know the cultures that you come across. How far does this apply to the work that you have been doing in the media and being posted to different countries, I guess? How have you become attached or not as a journalist, and also, I guess, as a person to the context that you have encountered?
Well, I think in the context of the book, what I'm going to say is applies probably more to younger journalists. But you get sent to places sometimes that you've never been to before, and although you may have read up a lot about it, there's nothing like being immersed in the real thing. And certainly in my career, I was very dependent on local journalists and local helpers. And the BBC, fortunately, has a wonderful network of foreign language reporters scattered around the world. So I don't think I was ever in a situation where I was sort of on my own. I always had a very knowledgeable local guide who could help and support me and give me contacts and things like that. So very often, particularly in the mainstream media, you see kind of trench-coated white, usually men, popping up to report on some event that has happened very recently. But almost always behind them are local people who are helping and supporting them, without whom the news wouldn't get out.
Thank you for this. So you were working especially, I guess, also with local teams, as you've just mentioned. I know that your book is fictional, so the characters in the book take on different names, and not historical names, but could you perhaps clarify a bit what was happening, especially in Haiti, what was unfolding in the late 1980s for our speakers who aren't aware of this?
Yes, I mean, Haiti's got a fascinating history, and perhaps we could speak a little bit about that, because it is not that well known. And indeed, one of my motivations for writing the book was to set it in Haiti, because I've always felt very strongly that it deserves much more attention than it gets. But in the late 1980s, Haiti was coming out of a period where it had been ruled by one dynasty for a long time, for about 40 years. First Papa Doc and then Baby Doc Duvalier, who were very clever but very oppressive rulers who relied almost totally on the army to keep them in power, and a network of secret police who were called the Tonton Macoute, who were in every village, knew everything about everybody and reported back. So it was when Baby Dog finally fled, there were sort of popular uprisings to remove these people. There was a succession of military rulers and an attempt to have democratic elections, which failed. The first time, people were literally murdered at the polls. And the second time there were elections, but the man who was elected was rapidly thrown out in a coup. So it was a period of great instability, not unlike the story today. So I've kind of very loosely set it around events that happened in the late 80s. But the book is deliberately timeless.
And still relevant today. Well, of course, a lot of gang violence is still crippling the country today. The president, the new prime minister, I think Moise, was sworn in a couple, I think last year, if I recall well. So it is definitely something that's still very relevant.
Yes, so there's a kind of transition has happened since the 80s to today. In many ways, the violence still looks remarkably similar, but what's happened is back in the 80s, the army held all the weapons. And the population were unarmed. They were often very brave and went out and made their feelings very clearly known, but they didn't have weapons. What's happened over that period is the central government has lost control more and more, and weapons from not just the army, but from drug smugglers and other people who like to see chaos because it means they can just do what they like, have spread throughout the country. So you've got now these kind of devolved gangs, many of whom were connected to politicians in the past and present.
Well, definitely, it is true that weapons and that kind of free circulation forms a big part of your book, which also notably speaks about, for instance, the moments where you have also encountered such violence. I think the first scene, the opening of your book, is quite startling with regards to that violence that you've come across. So perhaps could you give us a little glimpse of that opening scene? Definitely marked me.
Well, there's a few events in the book that did actually happen to me, not necessarily in Haiti, but happened to me somewhere. But the opening scene is something that did happen to me in Haiti. And it was, I was doing what Lucas did, which was follow demonstrators who were sort of parading around the city, making it clear they wanted an end to oppression and for the end of dictatorships. And these demonstrations tend to follow a pattern. They meander through the streets, picking up people as they go. So by the time they end up, in this case, in front of the presidential palace, they're very large numbers of people.
How disparate was that population of protesters?
Surprisingly,
from what backgrounds were
surprisingly disparate. I mean, there were lots of students from the university. There were workers. You could tell who the workers were because workers in Haiti carry machetes because they work in the fields and things. And certainly on the periphery, there were some middle-class people. A lot of the middle-class people tended to kind of watch from the hills and not get too involved. But you certainly did meet often the children of middle classes who were out on the street and very angry at what was going on. And the scene you refer to was, I was on it was a student demonstration, and we were going through the centre of town and got to a junction, and I was pretty close to the front of the demonstration, and we saw a military truck full of soldiers drive across the bottom of the junction in front of us and disappear around the corner. But they all looked as though they all had weapons, and they all looked as though they were about to jump off. So the crowd saw this and, as one, kind of turned and ran back up the street, and I naturally ran with them. But I got about 100 yards away and looked back, and there were no soldiers. So I thought, well, I'm missing the story here. And clearly the soldiers are doing something else around the corner. I need to go and see what's going on. So I went back, and just as I got to the corner, 2 or 3 of the soldiers appeared and started to come up the street the students had been in. and were levelling their rifles to fire shots at the retreating students. So I turned and ran. And normally what you're told to do in these situations is look for an alley or an open door or something to dive into. And on this particular day, I mean, it must have been a Sunday or something, because there were no open doors.
I think you mentioned,
yeah. So I dived into a ditch because the soldiers had started shooting, and I wanted to get out of the way of that. And everything seemed to go quiet, and I stuck my head above the ditch to see whether I could head off again. I couldn't see anybody. I was just getting out, and the soldier appeared from I don't know where and levelled his rifle at me and was very close to me and aimed at my chest. So I thought that was it. And strange things happen to you when you're under stress. It's one of the themes of the book. One of the things that happens in the book. It describes sort of several stressful situations. But in my case, time just slowed up. And I had time to think that if I was going to be shot, I'd rather be shot in the back than the chest, because whoever came to find me would see that I'd been shot in the back, and therefore I hadn't been a threat. It was sort of cold-blooded murder. So I turned, and the soldier fired his rifle, but he must have lifted his sights just at the last minute, and the bullet went into the wall over my head. And so I just stayed there for quite a long time and waited until there was nobody else around and got out.
Quite an incredible story as well. I guess it's hard to imagine what context and what might have gone through your mind at that point. It's certainly something that's highly affected the readers that read your book as they open the first page. And so, to clarify, this happens to Lucas in your book.
It does, yes.
So Lucas is the main character, he's the protagonist of the book, so this journalist that we follow throughout in Haiti. But nonetheless, when you're basing your characters in that book, from which backgrounds are you inspiring yourself from? Are you inspiring yourself only from what you encountered in Haiti, or about different contexts that you might have visited throughout?
No, I mean really your question is, how do you write a novel? So
Yes.
And I think it was my first novel, so although I'd read a lot, I'd never written one, so I had to, and I'd always thought, I had this running joke with my brother, that it's very easy to write the first chapter of a novel. It's also quite easy to write the last chapter of a novel. It's quite tricky to do the bit in between. And we used to say it would be a good idea to write beginnings and endings, stick them all in a book, and then have a competition for people to write the middle, and the winner would get a prize. What I did was I kind of didn't start at the beginning. I started in the middle. So I wrote a few scenes that I thought might be in a novel.
For any essay writers here in Cambridge, he did not do that.
But this worked for me, because my big fear was that I would start and then be unable to finish, because I'd get stuck in the middle. So writing some chapters that could be the middle of a novel gave me something, I suppose, distilled the fear of getting stuck. So that went away. And actually, one of those chapters became the first chapter later on.
So you were shuffled.
Yeah. But also, I also didn't know how the book was going to end. And that's one of the things that really kept me going. Every morning I got up and I kind of wanted to know what was going to happen next. So I hadn't mapped it out. And that helped me.
Speaking of ending, I just want to tailor this to a specific moment in the book, which speaks about voodoo spirits. And that's kind of the idea as well. In Haiti, it's very prevalent, the belief in voodoo spirits, and the idea of life's continuity. So here, not necessarily knowing the ending in some sense. Can you speak also a bit about the relevance of voodoo spirits as you were encountering them in Haiti, and kind of debunk that whole culture for our listeners here today?
Well, what Lucas has a secret, and his secret is that his sister, who he was very close to, was a bit younger than him, but died at school, and it looked initially as though she committed suicide, and he feels very guilty and obviously incredibly sad about this, because he feels he should have spotted it coming and done something. And when in times of stress, or when he's making a big decision, he kind of still talks to her because they were so close, and somehow he feels she's still with him. And one of his motivations for going to Haiti was that he knows that Haiti has this voodoo culture. And people in Haiti believe the dead still have a very real connection to the living, influence the living, even have power over them sometimes. And that was, so there's a kind of connection there. And I think when all the Hollywood myth about voodoo dolls and people putting hexes on each other and the spirits getting out of graves and haunting people is not really what voodoo is about at all. Voodoo is more, it's a culture and a way of life that recognises that people you have loved and people who have passed away still exert a very real influence over your life. And if you look at it from a Western point of view, well, that's kind of, we accept that. If you've had parents who've died, they physically disappear, but they are still very much with you. And that applies in all sorts of circumstances. So there's a lot we have a lot in common. Some of the ideas that we have in the West are there in voodoo. And indeed, the Catholic Church is very influential in Haiti. And there are some very interesting similarities between Catholicism and voodoo.
Yes.
The Catholic Church, to put it very crudely, worships a spirit,
yes,
the Holy Spirit. And so there are obvious parallels. So it's not as alien as it first appears, but it is very strange superficially when you see the ceremonies.
Going back to what you were mentioning about Lucas's secret, about the idea that his sister passed away, you also mentioned in the book that it was a reason for him wanting to leave the UK and so wanting to pursue the job of a journalist. So I kind of want to segue here into the role of a journalist, as you've come across it and defined it yourself. There's a question in the book that's posed at some point, and Mary asks to Lucas, "Why do you do this? Why did you do this? Why did you choose to pursue journalism?"
I think it's people obviously pursue journalism for different reasons, but there's a kind of an altruistic approach where you genuinely want to bring information to light about things that are happening in particular places that the world should know about, and if the world does know about it, the world might be able to do something about it and improve people's lot. And that is a big motivator for a lot of journalists. But there's a bit of a dilemma in order to get the story and bring it to attention, the journalist has to go and do that job. And it can be quite a glamorous job. You find journalists who kind of always put themselves into the story. I was kind of initially brought up in trained to kind of keep yourself out of the story. So you hold a mirror up to society, is the way I was taught. So what you do is you hold the mirror up, and then society looks in the mirror and sees what's going on around them. So it's not about the journalist, it's about the story. And there's a line in the book where I think it's Lucas's mentor, Carla, who's a ferocious and mildly terrifying woman, but who says, "No, look, at some point, Lucas, you've got to step through the mirror."
Yes, I remember.
And I think what she means is you can't just remain objective all the time. You have to understand the story emotionally if you're going to tell the story truthfully.
Well, it's interesting. Well, journalism is also seen as a pillar, the kind of another estate of society in some ways. So it's interesting to understand where maybe the boundaries between that objectivity and subjectivity can come into play. And I was chatting about this with you earlier on during one of our discussions, and how journalists are supposed to be attached nonetheless to the stories they come across, but it's how they actually then shine on that when reporting it back for the firms they've been working for. You mentioned this very early on in our talk today, but there is a big divide in terms of news coverage and in terms of which parts of the world actually receives most attention with regards to news in terms of main headlines. There's a specific choice that I made today by starting off with African news. You especially also worked on the Middle Eastern and African departments. How did you see this division in terms of reporting?
Yes, no, I was very pleased to hear you do that, because we tend to get a digest of what the news editors in Britain consider to be the most important news. And there's this view in newsrooms in the UK where you're only going to report what you think your audience is really interested in. But those decisions are quite often taken without much research going on. It's basically the opinion of the news editor. It's kind of a gut feeling. So recently, the news has been absolutely obsessed by Gaza and Israel. And that has been the main headline almost continuously for months. But of course, there's an awful lot else going on.
If there's one news headline that you would like to invite our listeners to know a bit more about, what would you suggest?
Well,
kind of a news story to uncover.
Oh gosh. Well, the best news stories are the things you already know but you haven't realised are news. They're kind of hidden in plain sight. So we've come to kind of socially accept something as the norm, but when you step back and think about it, you just think, well, that's just not the right way to do things.
Well, what makes a good news kind of pitch?
Well, no, sadly, it is when things don't fit. It's when things go wrong. It's where things have fallen short of what they should have been, which is why people continuously say the news is very negative. And that's true. But I think there's two things that have, well, we could do positive and negatives. There's some things that have gone badly wrong with journalism over the last few years. And one of those things is that opinion has crept into news reporting to an extent that it should not have done. Mm-hmm. So I think coming from a BBC background, I would say this, but I think what the public want and need are facts. So you need to put the facts in as unbiased a way as possible in front of people and let them make their own minds up about what's going on. But more and more you see journalists reporting opinion as fact, and sadly we see the President of the United States doing this. So that's very challenging to deal with as a reporter. I mean, normally you would, if the President of the United States said something, you would absolutely report it because he's the head of the most powerful country in the world and it affects us all. It would be very rare just to let me finish the sentence. It would be very rare to 20, 30 years ago to discover that what the President had said was not true. Whereas now you have to fact check what the President of the United States says because not everything he says is true. I'll give you one example. He said that Ukraine started the war with Russia. Factually that's not correct. Russia invaded Ukraine.
Is this a case of journalists and how they do their job, or is it just the nature of how news is changing? What can you say about the idea of also the digital age with regards to news?
Well, I'd say it's what I was talking about was journalists and the way they behave. And not all journalists do that, but there has been a tendency to do that. And that has opened some journalists up to criticism. But on the good news side, I think one of the really positive things that is happening is that in a sense, everybody is a journalist. Everybody increasingly has access to social media. 50 years ago, very few people broadcast to the world, and the world had to listen. And now, you could pick up a phone, go out on the streets of Cambridge, take some video, and the world might listen to what you've got to say. And it's not inconceivable that could go viral, and you'd have more people listening to you than listen to Radio 4 today.
Actually, could you also take us through the initial processes of how you would report back when you were in Haiti, for instance? How would you report back to London? How you would record that? I mean, there's a captivating scene in that book that you recently published, An Elusive Truth, which, by the way, I highly recommend to our listeners today. But there's a point where you have your laptop, your computer, where you've recorded everything, and you actually, Lucas forgets it in the hotel room, and everything is on the one computer. Can you talk a bit about how you've seen that change in time in terms of how to record? Yes,
I mean, it's all, like everything else in the world at the moment, things have changed dramatically over the last 40 years or so. I mean, about 40 years ago, perhaps a bit longer, journalists, when they were reporting from overseas, had to send telexes, which popped up on bits of paper. And the only way to get them on air was somebody in the studio had to read them for the journalists, because telephone lines were appalling and the quality wasn't good enough to broadcast. And then that moved through to people carrying portable recorders around and recording their voices and feeding those down crackly telephone lines, which, interestingly, in the book, in the end, Lucas has to end up doing, because the internet's cut off. Mm-hmm. And the only way he can find to get his story out is to use a very old-fashioned analog telephone line that he finds and literally plug his equipment into the telephone and file it back. But now, of course, everything is digital. You can carry... you can put together features on a very small piece of digital equipment, put it on your computer, send it on the internet, and it arrives complete as a file in very good quality. Such good quality, it's hard to believe the person is thousands of miles away in very difficult circumstances.
Can you also speak a bit about music? I mean, there are some departments in radio and different news media that have kind of music departments. You start off kind of the producer as well in music band. Yeah. How have you seen music evolve in terms of how it's been broadcasted?
Well, it's followed a very similar pattern, and I think the struggle for broadcasters is to remain relevant and maintain listeners in a world where anybody can go off and do what they're doing, really. So I'm playing in a band in a week on Saturday, and the lead singer has a single out, but she's put her own single out, and it's getting played on... I heard it played on BBC Surrey the other day. Mm-hmm. And so there's no record company. She owns the rights, she did the recording. There's a degree of...
bureaucracy?
That's been cut out. And it also means that you can own your own material in a way that was very hard to do even 20 years ago. So I think it's kind of scary because there are so many voices and so much music around, and it can be quite hard to find. The world looks like raindrops falling with all of this stuff. And how do you find the stuff that's really going to interest you? But it's undeniably a positive development. It is kind of, I put it crudely, it's kind of democratizing music and information. And the problem that poses for us all is how do you find the good stuff? And clearly some good stuff goes viral, but then some bad stuff goes viral as well. And you have to sift through all that to be confident that what you're getting is factual. But you asked about how I did it when I was reporting. And there's stuff in the book about this as well, but the trick is to report what you see. Don't report what you don't see. Because if you've seen it and you know it's happening, then that's the best perspective you can give to somebody else. So you're not saying this is bad or this is good or this is the truth or it's a lie. You're just saying, I saw this happen. And then and that gives people information that they can do what they like with.
For any of our philosophers listening today, you can always read Public Sphere by Jürgen Habermas. It's quite an interesting piece, and I think it does capture the idea of where our public sphere is going today with kind of the heightening ideas of democracy. Well, it's first about the old revolutions and kind of the bourgeoisie coming in as the rising public sphere and how that might even get diluted and you have new hierarchies form when too much democracy actually comes into play. It's a very interesting piece. Speaking of democracy, though, are there places where you've reported that when you look at the news happening there today, are there instances of positive kind of
is there anything good going on in the world?
Anything good in terms of the news coverage that comes today? Positive stories of democratization that you've kind of seen enhanced?
Oh, good Lord, yes. I mean, think of Northern Ireland.
Mm-hmm.
You know, inconceivable that peace could have come again to Northern Ireland. When you look at what was happening back in the 60s, South Africa, absolutely astonishing that apartheid was defeated.
Actually, could you speak about your work in South Africa? I thought that was quite interesting when we discussed about it, kind of the whole atmosphere.
Yeah. Yes, I was in South Africa fairly briefly at the end of apartheid. But the BBC was interested in supporting radio and TV stations that were emerging from apartheid and thinking about their future. In fact, one of the characters in the book is, it's not based on, but it was inspired by a meeting I had with a young woman who had been fighting apartheid, but in South Africa. So lots of white people fled South Africa during apartheid and opposed it from London or Brussels or wherever. Yeah. But she had chosen to stay and had paid really a terrible price. That she'd lost contact with her parents, lost most of her friends, but she had worked tirelessly inside the regime to try and achieve change. And she had that look in her eye that Marie has, which is a bit scary. This is a very fervent, absolute believer that what she's doing is right, that drives her on in very difficult circumstances.
Speaking about young people, their drive, I mean, there are a lot of statistics, especially on the African continent, about the rising youth, the rising number of youth, about almost half the continent by the end of this decade. At the same time, we were talking about the idea of change, and the idea of political change as well is quite relevant to think about, especially, I mean, I mentioned this at the very start of the show, Cameroon, the recent president elected, or now it's been contested, but he was going on for his 8th mandate, the oldest president in the world. There's a lot of criticism that's been spoken of out there about the gerontocracy of a lot of these structures. But at the same time, you have kind of the reverse happening in some parts of Africa. If you look at West Africa, if you look at Senegal, especially today, you have some Senegalese new leaders who are very young. Do you see any change with regards to kind of how this is unpacking on the continent? And you can also kind of speak of regions in particular, because it's quite hard to generalize, I suppose. But in terms of the countries that you've worked in, how would you define like kind of the political institutions that you've come across?
Well, broadly, I'm quite encouraged. When I became head of Africa and Middle East at the BBC World Service, there were still loads of civil wars going on in Africa. I mean, terrible civil wars where lots of people were being killed, and countries that had potentially a very bright future were being decimated. And I think that a big shift has happened in Africa. There's a lot more positive news there's more stability than there was. There's still problems, but you don't get the kind of civil wars that we used to have, which were pretty terrifying. So I think the trend, is a positive one. I think the fact that there are a lot of wonderful things about African societies, one of which was they respect age and equate it with wisdom. But you can't take that too far. And the fact that it is predominantly young and has all the vibrancy that comes with that is a good thing. As an aside, I think it's a jolly good thing that we're lowering the voting age in the UK. Mm-hmm. The future is for young people, and the sooner they get involved in the political process, the better. So I think that trend to more youthful leaders is good. You don't have to be 80 to be president. But one of the disappointing things, I think, is presidents who bust the Constitution and stay on for longer than the Constitution said they should do. I don't think, in my humble opinion, my 3 terms of office for a prime minister or a president is plenty. You're going to be exhausted by the time you've done that. There's a very interesting case in Rwanda, with Paul Kagame, mm-hmm. who arguably ended the massacres that were taking place and has brought an enormous amount of stability to the country, and a lot of progress has been made. Rwanda's a very different place today than it was 20 years ago.
Is that also based on the...
But he's staying on. So, and, surely any politician's job is to make things better and then hand over to somebody else who continues to make things better. And that has to be the ultimate ambition.
Yes, it's quite interesting you bringing the case of Rwanda as well. There's a lot of new positive signs happening there. There have been a lot of discussions also with the French government that's been more pulling back. You want to speak a bit about...
Yes, I think Rwanda's even is part of the Commonwealth now, isn't it?
Yeah.
I think they've applied and successfully, which is very interesting. And again, speaks to an ambition of wanting to be part of the international community and wanting to kind of return to the world after the genocide. It's got... these are not easy. The genocide was absolutely appalling and must never happen again. And Rwanda has to cope with these twin pressures. One is it never, ever, ever wants to go back to that. And there's a constant fear that if they get it wrong, another genocide will happen. And so the demand for strong government is very powerful. And at the same time, it wants to open up to the world, allow, all these crazy things that are happening with digital media and people saying anything they want and all the rest of it, and to feed that all into what they will hope will be a really dynamic economy and make everybody's lives better. And those two things have to be managed at the same time. That's very tough.
A lot of what you're saying also about kind of letting go of the past, etc. The idea of attachment as well resonates very clearly in your book. I wonder, you've based your book off of what you've experienced, but if you were to speak of one other book that has influenced you whilst writing your own, or just a book that you've found truly inspiring, just in general, is there anything that kind of crosses your mind?
Well, a writer I really admire is William Boyd, because I think he has his own style, and I love the way he places his characters against a backdrop of world events and historical figures you're very familiar with. I come away from reading his books thinking his main character is a real person, because it's so convincingly set in surroundings I recognise. But then, of course, you go and look up the character and they're fictional. They don't exist. And I think that's very clever. I think convincing the reader that what you're reading, which is fiction, is real, is a very neat thing to have achieved. So I certainly admire him.
As we go, here I'm speaking about myself and other Cambridge students or students world, as we go into the real world, as a segue to your point, you were mentioning as well kind of the idea of drive that you can see also in a lot of youth. You yourself, coming out of your degree in English literature at Oxford, certainly probably have that drive as well to just start working and kind of to get your grips with the work industry. What would you give as advice in terms of people studying English literature, or in terms of how you first approach that work, real work, philosophy, to our listeners here today?
Don't hesitate to go after what it is you want to do, or to do something that might seem foolish, but you know it's something you do want. It's something that appeals to your heart, or makes the palms of your hands sweat, or something that you feel passionate about and that you'd like to devote your time to. Then you should do it, even if you can't see how that is necessarily going to make you money to start with. Speaking as a failed rock star, and then you won't look back and regret that you didn't at least try. And if you try your best at something and you don't succeed, you don't blame yourself for that. You think, well, I gave it a shot. So that would be one bit of advice. The other thing is, I don't know you very well, Lise, but I see yourself throwing yourself into life in Cambridge and doing lots and lots of different things. And I think that's brilliant. Oxford and Cambridge and good universities teach you a lot and give you lots of academic opportunities, but they give you lots of other life opportunities, which are terribly important and help form character, I think, and lead you off in directions you might not have ever thought of. If you told me when I left university I would end up being head of Africa and Middle East for BBC World Service, I would have thought you were absolutely insane. So one thing does lead to another.